This is the food fraud tabletop exercise, and this is the fourth video, a review of U.S. related laws and regulations. This was updated September 2016. So first off, we'll cover the most basic starting point is Fisma and the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And at the time of this grant, it was October 2012 to June 2013, food fraud and EMA was under the scope of the FDA Food Defense Group, specifically looking at all intentional acts. The Fisma intentional adulteration IA rule has defined the scope to only traditional food defense and to only catastrophic events or wide-scale harms. So what we've seen here is that early on, pre-Fisma, that really the Food Defense Group covered all intentional acts, and this grant was provided when food fraud, EMA, intentional contamination was still under that scope. Food fraud EMA is now in the Fisma Preventive Controls Rule, which is more traditional food safety. And one thing that FDA stated was that the Food Defense Acts were more one-off attacks, single attacks, and so there was a different type of countermeasure or control system needed, and that food fraud was more long-term. That these were things that were more reasonably likely to occur, possibly, and so that fell more under the preventive controls types of countermeasures than the food defense type actions. FSMA PC final rule is published, but there have been no additional guidelines or training for regulatory compliance other than the qualified individual training, which will soon be released. And the intentional adulteration qualified individual training has not been developed yet. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act has two sections, adulterated foods and misbranded foods. We mentioned those in an earlier video, but a key here is that this is still the foundation. And through the later final rules, especially after the Preventive Controls Rule, there's more of an emphasis and a reminder or reference back to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. So FSMA is in place, but it did not, it supports, it's additional to, but it does not supersede, it does not overrule the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act in this way. So it's reminding us that the adulterated foods and the misbranded foods sections are still in effect and still illegal, and really still drive the FSMA definitions. So if there's economically motivated adulteration, should there also be economically motivated misbranding? That's an interesting question. Other regulations that apply to companies include smuggling, tampering, theft, counterfeiting, securities, financial reporting. So there's a lot of other things that companies do need to worry about other than just the Preventive Controls Rule or the IA rule or even just FSMA. To look at the overall intentional adulteration text, there are 11 mentions of intentional adulteration in the Food Safety Modernization Act. And Section 106 talked about this to identify and evaluate known or reasonably foreseeable hazards that may be associated with the facility or the supply chain, identify and evaluate hazards that may be intentionally introduced, including by acts of terrorism. So intentionally introduced could be anything that's intentionally introduced, but specifically they're looking at terrorism itself. The key is that FDA requires written analysis of the hazards, and that's right there in the laws. And then overall, that there's more overall controls. And then they also look at the science-based mitigation strategies or measures. So these are the countermeasures, and specifically to look at this protection against the intentional adulteration of food. Now, whether it's in the IA rule, the PC rule, or others, all types of fraud are illegal under one law or another. But FSMA in this text just specifically defines that there needs to be a hazard. It needs to be a hazard review. It has to be written, and there has to be countermeasures for the hazards that require preventive control. And a key intentionally introduced. So we've created a series of food fraud initiative reports that review these in detail. So if you want to or need more information, please see our website, foodfraud.msu.edu. And so food defense, the IA rule is defined in the IA rule and includes only wide-scale health harm. This was defined really specifically, and it explicitly states that EMA is addressed previously in the Preventive Controls Rule, and it requires some type of assessment, and they include a food defense plan builder. And then mentioning again and pointing it out here, food fraud EMA is under the Preventive Controls Rule. Looking at the Preventive Controls Rule, really the conclusions that we found here is that really must address food fraud EMA that could lead to a health hazard. The PC rule is not the only food fraud regulation. So if you just meet the PC rule, there are these other um, requirements such as the adulterated food sections of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And it appears, not clear, not defined yet, but it appears that currently broad food fraud vulnerability assessment and food fraud prevention plan activities will lead to compliance with the FSMA PC regarding food fraud and EMA. So that's basically conducting a hazard assessment for food fraud and implementing a food fraud prevention strategy. We'll take a second to look at the preventive controls for human foods qualified individual training. So we presented here actually twice, I think at least twice, and there's more video support for this. So if you have more questions or if you do any training, please feel free to use this version. It's open to anybody. But this was chapter 5 that covers these hazards, and specifically we presented on the economically motivated food safety hazard. Here to note, just look at the title, economically motivated food safety hazard. So that's a different term. And really in the summary here, companies must know about hazards that may be in their products, period. There's no further clarification. So any type of hazard that occurs, you must address. Second, preventive controls for hazards requiring them must be documented in the food safety plan. So you've got to figure out you got to do an assessment to figure out which hazards are in your product or aren't in your product. And the ones that are dangerous, that are hazards that require this, you need to define in a plan. All hazards regardless of the scope. We go into much more detail, but that's a basic starting point. All hazards regardless of the source. Assessment and a control plan. Then looking at IA as well, there's been some interesting discussion about whether EMA is under food defense or not. And there was a public meetings in 2013 and 2014, and this was where they started discussing that ended up going in the final rule that IA narrows to only catastrophic events, and they further defined that as wide-scale harms. Disgruntled employees in EMA are to preventive controls. Well, I'd say so. They're in other parts of FSMA. An FDA is seeking comments on where and how EMA food fraud should be addressed in the final rule. And then it was finally published in September 2015. To look at a review of the PC rule, specifically for food fraud EMA, we did a keyword search that quickly conveys how much attention is given to EMA in the final rule. And in the Human Foods document, there's 906 pages, and the Animal Foods document has an additional 666 pages. So overall, there are 470,000 words in the two final rules. That's a lot. That's a lot of document, a lot of text. Listed below are keywords associated with EMA and the number of times they're mentioned in the two documents. The reasonably likely to occur is a key concept about what needs to have a control in place. 21 mentions. Reasonably foreseeable hazard, 123, so a little bit more. Fraud or fraudulent, 12 mentions. There's no specific mention of food fraud, but fraud in general is 12. Economically motivated adulteration is mentioned 40 times, but interesting is that the abbreviation EMA is not mentioned at all. Adulteration is 140, adulterated is 220, and specifically adulterant, the root for both of those possibly has 0 mentions. So just interesting to look at how these terms are all evolving and how they're used in the regulations. With that, we'll move on to the next presentation and move into the incident and the pre-incident overview.